The setting sun painted long shadows across the Johnson family ranch, its golden rays catching dust motes that danced in the cooling evening air. Emily Johnson moved with practiced efficiency through her evening chores, her boots crunching softly on the weathered boards of the barn floor. At 23, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the land as intimately as their own heartbeat. The horses nickered softly as she distributed fresh hay, her movements deliberate and sure. Her father's revolver hung at her hip, its familiar weight a constant reminder of his final words. "This land is your legacy, Emmy. Protect it like I taught you." The polished wooden grip bore the smooth patches where his hands had worn it down over decades of use. She paused at the barn door, taking in the peaceful scene before her. The cattle grazed contentedly in the distance, silhouetted against the purple mountains that had watched over their family for 3 generations. The evening breeze carried the sweet scent of prairie grass and wild sage, a fragrance that had been the backdrop to every memory she'd ever made on this land. But something felt off. The birds had gone quiet, and the evening air carried an unfamiliar tension. The horses sensed it too. Their ears pricked forward, muscles tense beneath their sleek coats. Emily's hand instinctively moved to her hip, fingers brushing the smooth grip of her father's revolver. That's when she heard it, the distant thunder of hoofbeats, too many to be friendly visitors. Through the settling dust, she counted 6 riders approaching, their dark silhouettes growing larger against the horizon. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, creating an ominous rhythm that seemed to match her steadying heartbeat. Even from this distance, she could see they weren't the usual ranch hands or travelers. These men rode with a predatory grace, their horses moving in formation that spoke of practice and ill intent. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a black hat pulled low over his eyes, sat tall in his saddle as they approached the main gate. His vest bore the telltale signs of hard living, and the gun at his hip had seen frequent use. Emily stepped back into the shadows of the barn, her mind already racing through the defensive plans her father had drilled into her since childhood. These men clearly expected to find an easy target, a young woman alone on a sprawling ranch. They had no idea they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The sun dipped lower, casting the ranch in deep purple shadows. Emily's fingers traced the familiar patterns on her father's revolver, each groove and scratch a reminder of the lessons he'd taught her. "Remember, Emmy," his voice echoed in her memory, "the land itself is your greatest ally. Use it wisely." If this story of courage and determination already has you hooked, subscribe and let us know in the comments what you would do if you found yourself in Emily's situation. Emily watched from the shadows as the riders drew closer, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust that caught the dying sunlight. The leader pulled his mount to a stop just yards from the barn, his dark eyes scanning the property with calculated precision. His leather vest bore the scars of countless fights, and the gun at his hip had notches Emily didn't want to count. "Come on out, girl," he called, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "We know you're alone. No need to make this harder than it has to be." The men behind him shifted in their saddles, hands hovering near their weapons. Emily stepped into view, her stance relaxed but ready. She'd learned from her father that tension telegraphed your moves, and right now, she needed every advantage. "This is private property," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Whatever you're looking for, you won't find it here." The leader's laugh was cold, empty of any real humor. "That's where you're wrong, miss. We've been watching this place. Fine herd of cattle, good horses, and I'm betting there's plenty stored away in that house. Now, you seem like a sensible girl. Don't make us do this the hard way." One of his men, a wiry fellow with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck, spat on the ground. "Boss, why are we even talking? Let's just take what we want and be done with it." "Patience, Snake," the leader replied, his eyes never leaving Emily. "I'm trying to be civilized here." His hand rested casually on his gun belt. "Last chance, girl. Step aside. Let us take what we need, and you won't get hurt." Emily's fingers brushed her father's revolver, remembering his words about moments like this. "A gun's not just a weapon," he'd told her. "It's a statement. Make sure you're ready to back it up." "I've got a counteroffer," Emily said, her voice carrying across the yard. "Turn around, ride out the way you came, and you all get to leave here breathing." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. The leader's expression darkened. "You've got spirit, girl, I'll give you that. But you're outnumbered 6-1. Even if you're half as good with that gun as you think you are, those aren't odds anyone can beat." Emily's lips curved into a slight smile. "Then I guess you'll have to find out just how good I am." Her words carried no bravado, just the quiet confidence of someone who knew their own capabilities. The tension crackled between them like lightning before a storm. Both sides knew that the next move would determine everything. Emily's mind flashed back to a crisp autumn morning 5 years ago. Her father stood beside her at their makeshift shooting range, his weathered hands adjusting her grip on the revolver. "Remember, Emmy," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "it's not about being the fastest, it's about being the smartest." She could still feel the cool metal against her palm as she practiced, hour after hour, until the gun became an extension of her will. Her father, James Johnson, hadn't raised her to be helpless. He'd seen too many ranchers lose everything because they weren't prepared for the harsh realities of frontier life. "The land shapes us," he'd told her, watching as she hit target after target. "But it's our choices that define us." Those words echoed in her mind now as she faced down the outlaws. Her father had known someday she might face a moment like this. The lessons hadn't stopped at shooting. He'd taught her every inch of their 1,000 acres, every ridge, every hollow, every hidden path that could give her an advantage. "Knowledge is power," he'd say, leading her through the complex network of canyons that bordered their property. "And the land holds more secrets than any gun." When the fever had taken him 2 winters ago, Emily had made a promise at his grave. She would protect everything he'd built, everything he'd taught her to value. The ranch wasn't just land and livestock. It was a legacy of determination, of standing firm when others would fold. The gang leader's voice cut through her memories. "Time's up, girl. What's it going to be?" Emily's hand rested on her father's revolver, feeling the familiar grooves he'd worn into the grip over decades of use. Each notch and scratch told a story of survival, of protecting what mattered most. Now, it was her turn to add to that history. "You know what your mistake was?" she called out, her voice carrying across the yard. "You saw a woman alone and thought you found an easy target. But what you really found was a Johnson, and Johnsons don't give up what's theirs without a fight." The leader's face darkened at her defiance. Behind him, his men shifted uneasily in their saddles. Something in Emily's voice, in her unwavering stance, had planted the first seed of doubt in their minds. She understood what her father had meant now, about being smart, about using every advantage. These men might have numbers on their side, but she had something better: purpose, knowledge, and the unshakable determination that came from defending what you love. The gang spread out in a practiced formation, 3 men dismounting while the others kept watch from their horses. Snake, the wiry one with the tattoo, moved toward the barn while 2 others approached the house. Their boots kicked up dust as they walked, weapons ready. Emily had already disappeared into the shadows, her movements silent and purposeful. She knew what they couldn't, that the apparent vulnerability of the ranch was an illusion. Every building, every fence line, every seemingly random pile of equipment had been positioned with defensive scenarios in mind. "Check the house," the leader ordered, his voice carrying across the yard. "Find anything valuable, and watch yourselves. Something ain't right about this." Emily moved through the barn's hidden passage, one her father had built years ago. It connected to a series of underground storage cellars, allowing her to move unseen between key positions around the ranch. From here, she could emerge at any of 5 different points, each offering a tactical advantage. The sound of breaking glass echoed from the house. They'd forced their way in. Emily gritted her teeth but held her position. Let them think they had the upper hand. Snake prowled through the barn, his revolver drawn as he kicked aside hay bales and peered into stalls. "Nothing much in here, boss," he called out. "Just some old tack and feed." What he failed to notice was the thin wire at ankle height, carefully strung between posts. Emily had positioned it there months ago, after the first rumors of outlaws in the territory. As Snake moved deeper into the barn, his boot caught the wire. The reaction was instant. The tripwire released a mechanism that sent a cascade of heavy grain sacks tumbling from the loft. Snake barely had time to look up before the bags knocked him flat, pinning him beneath their weight. His shocked yell brought 2 more gang members running. Emily used their distraction to move positions, emerging from a root cellar behind the house. From here, she had a clear view of the leader and his remaining men. Taking careful aim with her father's revolver, she fired a single shot. The bullet sliced through the air, striking the ground inches from the leader's boot. The precision of the shot left no doubt. It had landed exactly where she intended. "That's your last warning," she called out, her voice steady and clear. "The next one won't miss." The leader's face contorted with rage. "Find her!" he roared, drawing his own weapon. "Find her now!" But Emily had already disappeared, using another hidden route to change positions. The outlaws were playing her game now, and they didn't even know the rules. Emily moved like a shadow through the familiar terrain, leading the outlaws deeper into the narrow canyon that cut through their property. The high walls rose on either side, creating a natural funnel that would work to her advantage. Her father had taught her well. Every feature of the land could become a weapon if you knew how to use it. The gang followed, their initial bravado fading as the terrain grew tighter. The leader's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "Spread out! Don't let her trap us here!" But his warning came too late. The sound of loose rocks skittering down the slopes made his men nervous, their heads snapping up at every noise. Emily reached a hidden alcove where she'd stashed supplies for just such an occasion. With quick, practiced movements, she lit the fuse on a bundle of dynamite. Not enough to cause a cave-in, but plenty to create chaos. She threw it high, watching it land among the loose rocks above the canyon. The explosion shattered the evening silence. Rocks cascaded down, blocking the outlaws' retreat. Horses reared in panic, throwing 2 riders to the ground. Through the settling dust, Emily took careful aim with her father's revolver. The familiar weight steadied her hand as she sighted down the barrel. 2 shots rang out in quick succession. The first knocked the gun from Snake's hand as he tried to aim. The second shattered the canteen of another outlaw. Her message was clear. She could have killed them, but she was choosing not to. The precision of her shot sent a wave of unease through the remaining gang members. "Your next move better be careful," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the canyon. "I've got plenty more surprises waiting." She'd already moved to another position, using the network of passages her father had shown her years ago. The leader's face contorted with rage, his carefully laid plans unraveling. "You think you're clever, girl? You're just delaying the inevitable. We've got men coming, enough to overrun this whole territory." Emily's response was another shot, this one grazing his hat. The bullet kicked up dust as it ricocheted off the canyon wall. "Then I suggest you start riding to meet them. You'll need all the help you can get." Her confidence unnerved them more than any threat could have. She'd positioned caches of ammunition throughout the canyon, allowing her to move from point to point while maintaining pressure on the gang. Each time they tried to advance, she'd appear from a new direction, her shots growing more precise, more threatening. The canyon amplified the gunfire, making it impossible for them to tell how many defenders they faced. "Boss!" one of the outlaws called out, his voice shaking. "This ain't worth it! That girl's toying with us!" The fear in his voice was contagious, spreading through the remaining men like wildfire. The leader's response was cut short by another explosion, this one closer, showering them with dirt and pebbles. Emily had them exactly where she wanted them, rattled, confused, and beginning to doubt their chances. The canyon, once their path to easy plunder, had become a trap, and they were the prey. The outlaw leader paced furiously behind a boulder, his plans unraveling with each passing minute. He'd lost contact with 2 of his men, and the others were pinned down by Emily's relentless assault. Pulling a battered pocket watch from his vest, he checked the time and cursed, the silver case stained with blood from his earlier wounds. "Snake!" he barked, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Ride out through the back trail. Get to Carson's Creek and bring back everyone. I mean everyone." His eyes blazed with a mixture of rage and desperation. "Tell them to bring extra ammunition! This girl's got the whole canyon rigged!" Emily, watching from her hidden position among the rocks, allowed Snake to escape. His hasty retreat would work to her advantage. She'd anticipated this move. Desperate men always called for reinforcements. What the outlaws didn't know was that she'd already sent her own messages across the territory. Hours earlier, she'd released 3 horses with distinctive markings, a signal to nearby ranchers that trouble had come to the Johnson place. It was a system her father had established years ago when outlaws first started appearing in the territory. Each horse's markings and direction told a specific story, alerting different parts of the community. A white-footed mare heading north meant immediate danger. A bay with a star galloping east called for armed support. The remaining outlaws regrouped, taking defensive positions while awaiting their reinforcements. Their leader's confidence had transformed into cold fury. His reputation was crumbling by the minute. No one had ever humiliated him like this, least of all a lone woman on a remote ranch. "When our men arrive," he shouted into the growing darkness, his voice cracking with rage, "there won't be anything left of this place. You hear me, girl? Nothing. We'll burn every building, scatter your cattle, and salt your fields." Emily moved silently through her network of hideouts, conserving ammunition and planning her next move. The outlaws' numbers would grow, but so would her support. The community her father had helped build wouldn't stand idle while one of their own was under siege. She could already see the first signal fires blazing on distant hills. Her message had been received. Through her spyglass, she counted dust clouds rising from multiple directions. The question was, whose reinforcements would arrive first? The outlaws' desperate call for help had turned this personal vendetta into something much larger. A fight for the soul of the territory itself. The sun was setting now, painting the canyon walls in deep reds and purples. Emily checked her remaining ammunition, mentally calculating the time until darkness would provide her new advantages. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Night's not just about darkness, Emmy. It's about knowing your ground better than they know theirs." Word spread through the territory like wildfire, carried by urgent riders and signal fires blazing across hilltops. Emily's stand against the outlaws had ignited something in the community, a determination to no longer live under the shadow of fear. As the sun climbed higher, horses thundered across the plains toward the Johnson ranch. First came the Hendersons from the neighboring property, Tom and his 3 sons riding hard with rifles across their saddles. Behind them, old Jake Murphy, who'd fought alongside Emily's father in their younger days, led a group of seasoned ranchers. Even Sheriff Cooper, despite being 2 towns over, had gathered a posse and was making his way toward the conflict. "Your father would be proud," Tom Henderson told Emily as they gathered behind the barn to plan their defense. "He always said this community needed to stand together. Guess it took his daughter to show us how." Emily nodded, quickly laying out her strategy. She'd already bloodied the gang, using her knowledge of the land to separate and confuse them. Now, with reinforcements, she could turn the tables completely. "They'll try to come through the canyon," she explained, sketching a rough map in the dirt. "It's the only approach that gives them cover, but that's exactly what we want." Her finger traced the narrow passage. "These ridges give us the high ground. We can catch them in a crossfire." Jake Murphy, his gray beard catching the sunlight, grinned appreciatively. "James taught you well, girl. But what about their scouts? They're bound to have eyes watching our movements." Emily smiled, a glint of her father's tactical genius in her eyes. "Already handled. I've been leading them to think I'm alone and desperate, falling back toward the canyon. They'll expect me to make my last stand there, Instead, they'll find themselves walking into a trap. The assembled group broke into smaller teams, each with specific positions and roles. Emily had transformed from a lone defender into a commander, her quiet confidence inspiring those around her. These weren't just neighbors anymore. They were a unified force, ready to end the outlaw threat once and for all. "Remember," Emily addressed the group, her voice carrying the authority of someone twice her age. "We're not just defending one ranch, we're taking back our territory." These men thought they could prey on what they saw as weak and isolated. Today, we show them just how wrong they were. The sky had darkened to a deep purple when the thundering of hooves announced the arrival of reinforcements from both sides. Emily watched from her elevated position as more than 20 outlaws rode into the valley, their weapons gleaming in the fading light. Snake had done his job well, rallying every desperate character within riding distance. The gang members spread out in a practiced formation, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust that drifted through the canyon like smoke. But Emily's message had spread equally far and wide. Tom Henderson and his 3 sons appeared on the ridge to her left, their rifles ready and steady. Old Jake Murphy and his ranch hands materialized like ghosts along the canyon walls, their positions carefully chosen to provide maximum coverage. Even Sheriff Cooper had arrived with a small posse, positioning themselves to cut off any escape routes. "Last chance!" the outlaw leader shouted, his voice carrying a hint of desperation beneath the bravado. "Clear out now, or we burn everything to the ground! You've got 30 seconds to show yourselves before we start shooting!" Emily's response came in the form of coordinated rifle fire from multiple positions. The outlaws scattered for cover, suddenly realizing they'd ridden into a carefully prepared killing zone. Every boulder, every depression that might offer protection had already been mapped and targeted by Emily's defenders. "Push forward," the leader commanded, but his men hesitated. The precision of the defenders' fire had shaken their confidence. 2 outlaws fell from their horses, wounded but alive. Emily's allies were following her lead, shooting to disable rather than kill. Emily moved between positions with the grace of someone who knew every inch of the terrain, coordinating the defense with hand signals she'd learned from her father. Each group knew their role, the Hendersons providing covering fire, Murphy's men preventing any flanking attempts, and the sheriff's posse steadily advancing to compress the outlaws' position. The battle erupted in earnest, gunfire echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Emily's defenders had the advantage of height and preparation, but the outlaws fought with the desperate fury of cornered wolves. The air filled with smoke and the sharp crack of rifles, creating a chaotic symphony of battle. Through her spyglass, Emily spotted the gang leader trying to organize a charge up one of the less defended slopes. With calm precision, she took aim with her father's revolver and squeezed the trigger. The shot struck his horse's saddle, sending him tumbling to the ground. His curses echoed through the canyon as his planned assault fell apart before it could begin. The outlaws' formation began to crumble as more of their members fell or surrendered. Those who remained found themselves being systematically cut off from each other, their superior numbers rendered meaningless by Emily's strategic positioning of her defenders. The outlaw leader rose from behind the rocks, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, and his once pristine black coat was covered in dust and grime. "Face me yourself, girl!" he roared, discarding his rifle and drawing his revolver. "Or are you too scared to fight without your army?" Emily considered his challenge carefully from her elevated position. Around them, the gunfire had slowed to sporadic shots as both sides watched the confrontation unfold. She knew what he was doing, trying to salvage his pride with a final, desperate gambit. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows that danced across the canyon floor. "You wanted this land so badly," Emily called back, her voice steady and clear as mountain water. "Come and take it." She stepped into view on a flat outcropping, her father's revolver held loosely at her side. The setting sun cast long shadows across the canyon, turning the dust-filled air into a golden haze. The leader charged forward, his boots sending gravel skittering down the slope. His reputation was in tatters, his gang demoralized, and now his only chance at redemption rested on outdrawing a rancher's daughter. Sweat gleamed on his face as he covered the distance between them, each step bringing him closer to what he believed would be his moment of triumph. Emily watched him approach, her father's words echoing in her mind. A gunfight isn't won in the moment of drawing. It's won in the heartbeat before, when you decide what you're willing to fight for. Her hand remained steady, inches from her holster, as she measured his approach with practiced eyes. The distance between them closed rapidly. 30 paces, 20, 10. The leader's hand hovered over his holster, his eyes locked on Emily's. The canyon fell silent except for the whisper of wind and the distant cry of a hawk. Even the wounded had stopped their moaning, sensing the gravity of the moment. "Any last words, girl?" he sneered, his fingers twitching with anticipation. "Your father ain't here to protect you now." Emily's response was a blur of motion that would become legend in the territory. Before the leader could react, her revolver had cleared its holster, the barrel aligned with deadly precision. Her first shot struck his gun hand, sending his weapon spinning away into the dust. The second bullet kicked up dirt between his feet, demonstrating her complete control of the situation. The leader staggered backward, clutching his bleeding hand, shock and disbelief etched across his weathered face. "How?" he gasped, looking from his wounded hand to the woman who had outdrawn him. "My father taught me more than just shooting," Emily said, keeping her revolver trained on him. "He taught me that true strength isn't about how many men you can command or how much you can steal. It's about what you're willing to protect." Her words carried across the canyon reaching every ear, friend and foe alike. The canyon grew quiet as the defeated outlaw leader knelt in the dust, his wounded hand dripping blood onto the sun-baked earth. The man who had terrorized the territory for months now looked small, his arrogance replaced with the bitter taste of defeat. Sheriff Cooper approached with handcuffs ready, his deputies moving to secure the remaining gang members who, seeing their leader fall, had thrown down their weapons in surrender. "Emily Johnson," Cooper said, securing the leader's wrists with practiced efficiency, "you've done what 3 territories worth of lawmen couldn't manage. You've broken the back of the most notorious gang in the region." His voice carried both admiration and a hint of professional chagrin. Behind him, deputies began collecting weapons and rounding up the surrendered outlaws. The outlaw leader spat in the dust, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. "A girl," he muttered, wincing as the cuffs tightened. "Brought down by a rancher's daughter." The disbelief in his voice made Emily smile slightly, remembering all those who had underestimated her before. "That's right," she replied, holstering her father's revolver. "And you'll have plenty of time to think about that in territorial prison." The gathered ranchers and lawmen chuckled, their relief evident as the tension of battle faded. The sound of victory spread through the canyon like a warming breeze. Tom Henderson approached, wiping sweat from his brow as he completed his count of the captured outlaws. 23 in total, Sheriff. Found 3 more hiding in the brush, trying to slip away." His sons were already helping to secure the prisoners for transport, their movements efficient and purposeful. Emily watched as the gang members were rounded up, their faces a mixture of shame, defeat, and lingering anger. These men had terrorized the territory for months, burning farms, stealing cattle, and destroying lives. Now they sat disarmed and bound, undone by their own arrogance and the determination of those they'd underestimated. Sheriff Cooper organized the prisoners into groups for transport, his experience showing how he separated the most dangerous from their followers. "We'll need to move them in stages," he explained, checking the bindings on each man. "Too many for one trip to the territorial prison. We'll take the leader and his lieutenants first, then come back for the rest." He turned to Emily, his expression serious. "You should know, there'll likely be a reward for this capture. A substantial one. The territories had bounties on these men for months." His eyes held a question, wondering what she'd do with such a windfall. Emily shook her head, her decision already made. Split it among the families they've hurt. That's what my father would have wanted." She looked around at the gathered defenders, ranchers, farmers, townspeople who had come together to protect their own. This was never about money. As the sun set behind the canyon walls, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the full impact of what they'd accomplished began to sink in. The territory would sleep safer tonight, knowing that justice had been served not by force alone, but by the courage of a community united against tyranny. The morning after the battle brought a different kind of activity to the Johnson Ranch. The air filled with the sounds of hammering, sawing, and the determined voices of a community working to heal the scars of conflict. Neighbors and friends gathered early, tools in hand, ready to repair the damage from the previous day's confrontation. The spirit of unity that had emerged in battle now transformed into a shared purpose of restoration. Emily stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching as Tom Henderson and his sons repaired the broken windows of the main house. The morning light caught the fresh-cut wood and new glass panes, symbols of renewal. Old Jake Murphy led a team fixing the damaged fences, their practiced movements speaking of years spent working the land. Others cleared debris from the canyon, erasing the physical remnants of the battle while preserving its lessons. "Your father always said this land brings out the best in people," Sheriff Cooper remarked, joining her on the porch. He'd stayed behind to help with the cleanup while his deputies transported the prisoners. His badge caught the morning sun as he surveyed the bustling activity. "Guess he was right about that, too. Never seen folks come together quite like this." Emily nodded, remembering her father's words about the importance of roots and community. "He used to tell me that a ranch isn't just about the land or the cattle. It's about the bonds between people who work it, protect it, love it. Yesterday proved him right in more ways than one." Throughout the day, more people arrived. Families bringing food in covered baskets and steaming pots, children carrying water to the workers, women organizing supplies and tending to minor injuries from the previous day's fight. The aroma of fresh bread and stew wafted across the yard, mixing with the scent of sawdust and new lumber. The Johnson Ranch had become more than just a battleground. It was now a symbol of their collective strength. As Emily worked alongside her neighbors, she noticed changes in how they treated her. The respect had always been there. She was James Johnson's daughter, after all. But now it was different. They looked at her not just as someone to protect, but as a leader in her own right. Young girls watched her with admiration, while seasoned ranchers sought her opinion on matters beyond the day's repairs. "You know," Tom Henderson said as they repaired a section of the barn roof, wiping sweat from his weathered eyebrows, "your stand against those outlaws has given folks courage. 3 more ranches down south were having trouble with rustlers. Yesterday they ran them off their land, word spreading. This territory isn't easy pickings anymore." The day's work continued under the warm sun, each repair strengthening not just the physical structures, but the bonds between neighbors. Women gathered in the kitchen, preparing meals and sharing stories of their own battles against adversity. Children played in the yard, reenacting yesterday's events with stick guns and exaggerated bravado, turning fear into adventure. By sunset, the ranch had been largely restored, though signs of the battle remained. Bullet holes in the barn door, scorch marks from the explosions in the canyon. But these weren't just marks of violence anymore. They were reminders of what a united community could accomplish. Each scar told a story of resistance, courage, and the power of standing together against those who would threaten their way of life. Word of Emily's victory spread across the territory like a prairie fire, carried by travelers and traders who stopped at every town and settlement. Each retelling added new details, yet the core truth remained: how a rancher's daughter had outsmarted and outfought the most notorious gang in the region, not through brute force, but through courage, strategy, and unwavering determination. In saloons and general stores, people spoke in hushed tones of how she'd used the land itself as a weapon, turning her father's teachings into a shield for her community. The tale reached other territories, inspiring similar acts of resistance against those who would prey on the vulnerable. Women particularly found strength in her story, seeing in Emily a symbol of what they too could achieve. Emily found herself receiving letters from distant ranches and homesteads, each envelope carrying stories of struggle and hope. Young women wrote seeking guidance on how to stand their ground in a world that often underestimated them. She answered each letter carefully, sharing her father's wisdom along with her own hard-earned insights. "Leadership isn't about being the strongest or the loudest," she wrote in one response to a young girl in Colorado. "It's about understanding your ground, knowing your purpose, and having the courage to stand firm when others would fold. The land teaches us patience, strategy, and the importance of choosing our battles wisely." Sheriff Cooper reported that other communities had started organizing their own defense networks, using the system of signals and cooperation that Emily and her father had developed. Ranchers who had once lived in isolation now worked together, creating networks of support that made their territories increasingly hostile to outlaws and bandits. The newspapers picked up the story, their headlines spreading Emily's legend further. "Rancher's daughter brings down notorious gang," read one. Another proclaimed, "Territory's angel of justice. How one woman's stand changed the West." Some papers embellished the tale, claiming she'd faced down 50 men instead of 23, or that she'd shot the guns out of multiple hands simultaneously. Emily kept these clippings not out of pride, but as a reminder of what ordinary people could achieve when they refused to back down from what was right. She stored them in her father's old desk drawer, alongside his journal and the first bullets he'd taught her to shoot. Visitors began appearing at the ranch, hoping to meet the woman who had become a symbol of resistance. Some traveled hundreds of miles, bringing stories of their own struggles against injustice. Emily received them with grace, but never lost sight of her true purpose, protecting the land and legacy her father had entrusted to her. Young women arrived seeking apprenticeships, wanting to learn not just about ranching, but about standing their ground in a world that often tried to push them aside. Emily began teaching them what her father had taught her, not just shooting and riding, but strategy, patience, and the importance of knowing your own strength. The legend grew, but Emily remained grounded in the daily work of running her ranch. She understood that her story had become something larger than herself, a beacon of hope for others facing their own battles against seemingly insurmountable odds. Yet she knew that true strength lay not in the legend, but in the quiet determination to stand your ground day after day, protecting what matters most. As winter melted into spring, Emily stood on the hill overlooking the Johnson Ranch, her father's revolver still faithfully at her hip. The land had healed from the battle, though subtle reminders remained. New fence posts standing stark against weathered ones, fresh paint covering bullet holes in the barn. The morning air carried the sweet scent of blooming wildflowers, mixing with the familiar smells of leather and horses. The morning air carried the sound of activity from below. More hands worked the ranch now, many of them young women who'd sought her out, eager to learn not just ranching, but the art of self-reliance. Emily had transformed the ranch into something her father might never have imagined, a place where strength and wisdom were passed on to a new generation. The sound of laughter and determined voices floated up from the training yard where two young apprentices practiced their shooting. "Miss Johnson!" a voice called from below. One of her new students, Sarah, waved from horseback. "Riders coming in from the east!" Emily smiled, recognizing the dust cloud approaching. Sheriff Cooper made regular visits now, keeping her updated on the territory's transformation. His visits had become a symbol of the partnership between law enforcement and the community. The changes stretched far beyond the ranch boundaries. Towns that had once lived in fear now stood tall, their citizens organized and vigilant. Trading posts and way stations had adopted her father's signal system, creating a network of communication that made it nearly impossible for outlaws to gain a foothold. Every week brought news of another community standing up to those who would prey on them. Emily descended the hill, pausing briefly at her father's grave. The simple wooden cross bore fresh flowers. Others still came to pay their respects to the man whose teachings had helped change the territory. "You were right, Pa," she whispered, touching the weathered wood. "The land does shape us, but it's our choices that define us." Sheriff Cooper dismounted at the gate, his face carrying good news. His once pristine badge now bore scratches from countless pursuits, each mark a story of justice served. "2 more gang leaders turned themselves in yesterday," he announced. "Said they'd rather face prison than try their luck against the Johnson Ranch's reputation." Emily nodded, understanding the power of the legend her stand had created. The ranch had become more than just a working cattle operation. It was now a training ground for those seeking to learn self-reliance and courage. Women from across the territory came to learn shooting, tracking, and strategy. Emily taught them not just the physical skills, but the mental strength needed to stand their ground. "Remember," she told her gathered students later that evening as they sat around the fire sharing stories and lessons, "what we did here wasn't about being the strongest or having the fastest draw. It was about standing together, about turning fear into determination. That's the real legacy we're building." Each day brought new challenges and opportunities. Emily continued to work the land, run the cattle, and teach others what her father had taught her. The legend of her stand against the outlaws had transformed into something greater. A story of how one person's courage could inspire an entire territory to find its strength. If this story of courage and community touched your heart, make sure to like and subscribe. Share in the comments what part of Emily's journey inspired you the most. And don't forget to tell us where you're watching from.